thank you all for turning up. I think if you count the amount of multiple people on some of the Zoom links, we probably nearly got 200 people on this call. I wish my own students were as diligent in turning up for a 9 o'clock start for a class. And I do want to, in a way, acknowledge, particularly for the young people listening, that our aim probably in communicating this information to you, and certainly my intention, I'm sure Salome is the same, is not to increase the already levels of anxiety many young people have. I think you've every right to be anxious and also angry in some ways at the state of the world that you've had little to do with. My concern as an educator, and I think there's a particular responsibility on ourselves, is that to be educating our young people, is to be responsible and be mindful, particularly of the emotional and mental health impacts. I mean, this is something that I never thought I'd have to do as a university professor, is put trigger warnings on the courses that I teach, because I realized that many young people were leaving after learning with me perhaps a little bit more anxious than they were coming in. So I think we have to acknowledge that this is not just a scientific issue, which Salome was kind of pointing out. It has a social impact on communities, but also, particularly for those of you listening in classrooms, just be mindful of your own emotional reaction. And it's very valid. I mean, that's why I have up here that I'm not describing myself as a professor and all those lovely big names that Katie called out, but as a worried father, I've got two children, 26 and 20, and I am really worried about their future because I'm looking at the science and seeing the way the world is emerging, both here in Ireland, Malawi, and elsewhere in the world. And it's already been acknowledged that the very people who've done least to cause this problem, largely those in the former colonized world, the global south and Africa and Asia, they've done little to cause this problem, and yet they're the ones suffering the worst impact. So there's a deep issue of justice here in terms of global justice, but also I think justice intergenerationally. For those young people listening, it's our obligation in the older generation. What is our obligation to you in the world that's now emerging? And so this, to me, signals a very unique issue that we have to face. That is not just about professors and the government and technology is going to solve this. I'll talk about how we need to rid ourselves of some of those assumptions that many of us have, particularly around technology. We have to change our entire ways of life. In the words of that film that I think got loads of Oscars, we need to change everything, everywhere, all at once. Now, that's a scary thought because most of us like to, stick with what we know. But I'm here to tell you, we are looking at the end of the world as we know it, if we want to, really address the climate and ecological crisis. But that's okay. It's only the end of the world as we know it. It's not the end of the world. But we do need to start looking at how we heat, how we eat, how we trade, how we, have food provided for us and so on. And all of these things, I think, are exciting possibilities in terms of creating not just a more resilient world in the context of the inevitable climate shocks we're going to receive, but a better world, a world with higher quality of life, but with less damage to the planet, a more globally just world where every member of the human family can have dignity and enough food and shelter and so on. So I really want to try and communicate that while it's scary, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves about the impacts that are already happening in picky places in the global south, there is an exciting possibility of actually using this crisis to create a better world. And I think that positive motivation that we can do something about it is what I want to communicate. We are not passive victims. I mean, if nothing else in Salome's talk, you see the resilience of communities coming together to respond. And that's what I want to try and communicate today, is that sense of hope and agency in what seems often these difficult times that we live in. Relax. I'm not going to go through all of this rather complicated diagram, but it's something that I usually start such talks out with. It's partly an emotional tracking of how we react to something like climate change. And of course, let's not forget about the, ecological crisis as well. We have a nature crisis as well as a climate crisis. But usually we start on the left with shock. We can't believe it. Then it's also denial. Well, how can human beings, affect the entire planet and so on? And many that some of you may know. In fact, some of you listening to me may be in either the shock or denial, and certainly maybe the fear aspect where we get very anxious about these changes. But usually it is at some point, and in looking at this curve, this is my daily working life, folks, where I go through all of these stages and loop back around on a daily basis. There is a point where you get very low mood. You do feel overwhelmed and depressed. And the reality is, and you've probably heard this hackneyed phrase quite a number of times, but it is true nonetheless. It's okay not to be okay. We have to acknowledge that, the idea of being blissful and energetic and happy all the time is impossible. Human beings aren't built like that. We go through a cycle such as I've described here, including feeling overwhelmed and low mood and feeling that we can't change anything. The issue is, so long as you don't stay there, if it's a temporary position, it is absolutely a normal part of human life and a normal way of reacting to such a big issue like the climate and ecological crisis. Hopefully then collectively, and this is part of our conversation this morning and the motivation behind the event, we can come together, share our, rage and grief and anger, and that's all healthy to get that out there. It's really negative to hold these, emotions in, and then say, okay, let's roll up our sleeves now and see what we can do. And that's the point in terms of generating hope comes through action and agency, of the type that Salome described. And we could already see that here on the island of Ireland in response to flooding events. Yes, you get the yellow vests, the guards and the fire brigade and the ambulances all come in and help. But also what you see is local communities, people coming together to help each other, the GAA, faith communities. So in response to a crisis, generally speaking, people come out and help each other. And we even seen that during that last great experience that we had of an emergency in terms of COVID. But it's something that I'd leave with you in terms of seeing where are you on this curve in relation to the climate crisis? Where's your family, members of your community? And you will have people at different stages. And this is not a linear process. You can loop back around in terms of new information, finding out after the discussion with somebody. But it is about an acknowledgement of the emotional as well as intellectual engagement with this issue. And sadly, Ron Burgundy, that you may know from the Anchorman series of films, is sadly correct. And I speak as an academic, and I think sometimes we're some of the dumbest, smartest people ever. We're also, a species that seems to be able to accurately document. Every year we get more compelling scientific evidence of how the climate crisis is getting worse. It is causing anxiety amongst people, particularly our young people. That's exacerbated then when we look at government and they're adopting milk and water, modest reforms, and sometimes even counterproductive reforms. I'm thinking here of the debate going on in the Irish Dáil at the minute about the planning bill, which seems to be opening the opportunity for liquefied natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, the very thing that's causing the climate crisis, that's now going to be seen as a strategic national interest. So in other words, what I'm trying to communicate is that our anxiety is warranted in terms of we have the scientific evidence, it's getting worse, and our governments are not reacting appropriately. And that's why, for me, there is no technical solution. It has to be ultimately a political one of we as citizens demanding that our governments, remembering, of course, the first job of a government is to protect its people. And I'm here to tell you this morning, our governments are not protecting us or our future generations. And therefore, we need to demand our governments to do the right thing. It's also an ethical issue in terms of our obligations to the next generation, in terms of justice, to pass on a world that's better, not just the same or worse than the one we inherited that I think Katie was referencing. And also, as Salome pointed out, there's a global dimension here, that there is an element in which we have obligations to each other which transcends borders. And for many people, sadly, they kind of think that, the climate crisis, particularly in the global north, in the former colonized world, and of course, Ireland has a complicated relationship with that because we ourselves were colonized. But we have to recognize that we have a debt in the global north. So that's Europe, European Union, North America, Australia, Japan, maybe South Korea. These are the richest parts of humanity, which make up maybe, depending on how you measure it, maybe 15 to 20% of humanity. They are living high carbon lifestyles. Of course, it's different within societies. We have many people in Ireland that aren't consuming enough, that are on the breadline. So I'm not saying everybody in these rich countries are living these high, affluent, opulent lifestyles, but there's a sense in that rich, northern, former colonized or colonizing world that somehow climate change is in the future. It's going to happen. It isn't. It's already here right now. But as this quote from William Gibson points out, it is unevenly distributed. If you're in Africa, as Salome pointed out, you're already experiencing this. If you're in Middleton in Cork, or up here in the north in Strabane or Portadown or Newry, you've already experienced climate change in terms of flooding events. We haven't seen it here where I live in Belfast. So just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean to say it's not happening. It's just happening somewhere else to somebody else. And the issue is, how do we then respond to that as human beings, given that, the reality is that we live extremely high carbon lives in the global north. If everybody, for example, in Ireland was to live at our level of resource use, carbon, food, red meat, dairy, and so on, we'd need at least 3 other planets. In other words, the Irish lifestyle is not sustainable. We only live those types of lives because other people in other parts of the world are not getting their fair share of the Earth's resources. If it makes you feel any better, it's even worse in North America. Your average American lifestyle will require 5 other planets at least. Now, last time I looked, there was only 1 planet. And so for me, you can encompass almost everything we've been saying up to this point in terms of the appeal and the need for one planet living. How can we as a species live within the planetary boundaries? And there is enough for everybody. Part of our problem is that we have distribution problems. We have a minority living very well with a lot of wealth and resources, and then other people going without. And we can't avoid that. The future, as I see it, has to be, for science-based reasons, ones that are a future that is less unequal globally, less unequal between generations, less unequal within societies in terms of class distinctions, which often, are an important issue. And also, although I won't have time to get into this, I also think we need to have a sense of obligation to the non-human world. What is the rights of nature in all of this? So justice for the future, for the next generation, justice globally for those, particularly in the global south, justice within our societies by class, by race, by gender, and also justice in some way, or at least obligation to the non-human world. That's a lot, I understand, to take on board. But I think we need to have that big picture view, and then it's for you as an individual. Okay, which bit of this issue do I want to take? Because you can't take it all. You have to find your spot in terms of activism, in terms of what you want to put your energies into, because this is a big, big issue. But the table of the changes that needed to be done is very long. There's a place for everybody. And of course, I can't oblige you to, join in this struggle, and it is a struggle. But I do think we are being derelict in the privileges that many of us have, particularly in the global north. What are we going to do with those privileges? Privileges of wealth, because we live in fairly wealthy societies. Privileges of living in democracies, where we can have our voice, at least in some way impacted on how government operates. And that's a privilege that many people around the world don't have, to live in democracies that are wealthy. So I think there's a particular obligation on those of us who live in the global north, who has the capacity, both in terms of our governance systems and the resources that we have and the time that we have, to actually do something, to roll up our sleeves, as I said earlier, and say, what are we going to do about this issue? And this is part of the kind of the academic bit, just to give you, this is a term that will probably become more prevalent in the years ahead, the idea of the Anthropocene. That simply just means, it's from the Greek word anthropos, is where we get words like anthropology. It means the age of the human. This idea that we as humanity are having a global impact in terms of, we are now witnessing the 6th great mass extinction event. Species are now going extinct. much quicker against the background rate of extinction. We're also clearly having a massive impact on the climate. And for some people, particularly, I'd have to say for some of the young people that I teach, they've switched from calling it the Anthropocene to the it's too late scene. It's too late. And in a way, this can lead to either, well, that's realistic. It is too late. We can't really change it. It's certainly not, a position I think is particularly useful, but I respect some who've come to that decision. And it can lead to, to go back to that Kubler-Ross cycle of people just staying in this kind of depressed. It's too late. They feel too overwhelmed and they just lost hope. And they're in that position of hopelessness. Another reaction I've also seen, and this is particularly for those young people listening to me, whether you yourself are in this or you've seen other people, of what I call here nihilistic hedonism. I'll break that down. Nihilism is a sense of the meaningless of the world. It's a cynicism. That's a very common, sadly, reaction in our contemporary society. And the hedonism is just seeking pleasure. So for a lot of people say, well, if it's too late, I'm going to party as this ship goes down, as it were. And I think that is also it's a not unreasonable response on the one hand, but I don't think it's very helpful, at least to be a permanent position. We all like pleasure. Sensuality is an important part of what it means to be human. But this nihilistic hedonism, I would warn against, as that's the response, because in a way, it's a negative. It's saying it's too late. Let's party as humanity goes to hell in a handcart. And because I'm a political scientist and also, for full disclosure, a recovering politician, I used to be a Green Party councillor up here in the north. This is something I've always been curious about. That for many in our culture today, and many of you may be even listening to me, I think this is true. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of this system of capitalism, this system of growth, consumerism, the inequalities in trade relationships, the inequalities within societies that we've almost accepted like a fact of nature. Nature is nature. It runs by biophysical laws. Capitalism, how we organize the economy, that's a human issue. We can change that. And my argument here would be capitalism is part of the problem. This system of a way of organizing the economy has come to the end of its useful life. I think we should give it a good Irish wake, thank it for its services, and move on. In a similar way to carbon energy, fossil fuel, it has done great things. It is now sadly just past the point our continuing burning of fossil fuels is causing the climate and ecological crisis. Again, we should thank the services of carbon and move on. This is a big issue. Easy to say, much more difficult to do. But for me, as somebody who's been researching and been active on this for over 3 decades, there is no capitalist solution to this crisis. We cannot innovate our way around this. We have to change the structure of our economies and our societies. And that even includes our imaginaries of the good life. If you think about it, for most of you listening to me, particularly young people, if I was to ask you, what's your vision of a good life in the future? I would imagine it'd be something like this. You've got a good, well-paying job. You have a good house that you own, maybe a second home somewhere else, maybe in a foreign country. You're going on foreign holidays every year. You enjoy good food and other material trappings. And that's not bad in terms of an aspiration. But the reality is that vision, that materialist vision of the good life, is actually unsustainable because we can't extend that to everybody in the world. There isn't enough planet for everybody, as I said, to live the average person lifestyle in Ireland, never mind America. We need to reimagine what is a good life. To me, it seems that it's a particularly appalling vision for young people that essentially our culture and capitalism and consumerism, our message to you of a vision of the good life is essentially whoever dies with the most stuff wins. And where does a life of purpose, a life of meaning, a life of service? So it's not about, I'm not arguing for poverty here. It's saying, can we not have enough? A vision of the good life that's about having enough. And then it's about quality of life, more meaningful free time, not necessarily, buying more things. And that's maybe something we can get into in the Q&A, because I'm absolutely convinced from a scientific point of view that in communities that Salome was talking about in Malawi and so on, We will not be able to allow that part of the human family to increase their quality of life unless we change our ways of life in the global north, because we're using up too much planet. And if I could put it provocatively, you often hear this in the climate and ecological debate, oh, there's a population problem. And usually what the person means is there's too many black, brown, and yellow people in the world. Well, I would say the reverse. We do have a population problem. Too many fat white Westerners like me. That's the population problem, because our population is having a disproportionate and unfair use of the world's resources. That's a pretty hard way of saying it. I appreciate that. But scientifically, as well as ethically, I think that's the issue we need to address. So that's why, as you can tell, I'm trying to be a down with the kids cool professor in terms of cultural references. This is from The Matrix. So we need to have that conversation. That capitalism itself, this system that is at most in one form or other, maybe 200 years old, in its current very globalized form, and consumerism and trade and long global supply chains is at most 40 years old. It's simply a temporary way of organizing the economy. Why on earth do we think the current way we organize the economy in capitalism, or our current energy system organized around fossil fuels, why on earth do we think there has to be a permanent way of organizing our energy system, or indeed the economy? And I do think, rather, interestingly, I think we need to embrace the apocalypse, or at least have, as I say here, 2 cheers for the apocalypse, because we have a very wrong view in the English language, and again, translating it from the Greek of what the apocalypse means. We think it's like the zombie apocalypse, it's all terrible, and there can be a meaning of that. But actually, really what the apocalypse means is the lifting of a veil. It's a revelation that the crisis we're now experiencing is an opportunity to reveal something new about a different direction for society to go in. And here's a quote from a very eminent climate scientist, Mike Hume. You can read it there yourself. Essentially, it's saying we need to overcome that kind of male, modern Enlightenment kind of thinking. If there's a problem, we're going to fix it. His view is the opposite with the climate crisis. It's what the climate is doing for us, not what we can do for it. It's actually this crisis we're now in is an opportunity to in the way in which you could say for many people during the pandemic, when they had to slow down and they were forced back in on themselves, having to work from home and so on, that they revalued their lives, they changed their lives, some of them changed their careers. And I think something like that is what the climate and ecological crisis should be framed in terms of an opportunity to create a better world, a very different one, but a better world, and not a green version of the current world that we have, which isn't working anyway for most people around the planet. And that's why we need to differentiate hope and optimism, just to begin to wind up. Optimism, you can see here in this quote from Václav Havel, who's the former Czech president and also very eminent writer and playwright. Optimism is the assurance that things are going to work out okay. You don't need to do anything. It's what we say in Ireland, it'll be grand. Well, I'm here to tell you it won't be grand. We can't outsource and be optimistic, because optimism is passive. Somebody else is going to do it. Oh, Professor Barry at Queen's and, Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, or God forbid, Elon Musk is going to whip us all off to Mars, or to some whiz-bang technology is going to solve it. I'm here to tell you that while we need technology and good leadership in government, it is necessary but insufficient. Hope is different. Hope requires agency and activism, and not this kind of passive outsourcing of hope, this outsourcing of agency to others. And that's why I think we need to really start questioning this kind of idea of techno-optimism, that somehow it's a comforting myth, that we don't need to change anything in our lives. We can still continue with our ways of life, and technology is going to solve it. I think that is going to be the way in which governments may go, and many of our populations in the global north may see the solution, but it won't work, because we have no evidence at all that we can decouple, that we can continue this ways of life that I described while reducing its ecological and environmental impacts at the scale that's needed, for example. And the issue here often is these techno solutions, they don't ask questions of justice. It's about, why do you want to green and decarbonize an already inequality producing exploitative system, which leaves many members of the human family behind anyway? Why on earth do you just want to green that as opposed to rethinking, reframing and restructuring the way in which we organize our societies. And sadly, this is how I think a lot of our political leaders and our policymakers, because I've met with them, I've talked with them, there is still this mythic sense that technology is going to save us, or we're going to have green growth, smart growth, and so. Well, why do we need growth at all? Honestly, for those of you listening to me, whenever you hear Irish GDP economic growth is up by 2%, does your heart sing? Does your chest swell with pride that Irish GDP and growth has gone up? I would say probably not, because when people hear growth, what they're really thinking of education, housing, jobs, transportation. And I'm here also to tell you, we can have those things without growth, but it does mean we're going to have to start redistributing the wealth that we created in a less unequal way. And for me, and that's the image on the right-hand side here of your guy jumping off the mountain, that's what this tech solution is. It's like jumping off a mountain and hoping you can knit your parachute on the way down. It's a very risky way of trying to address the issues that we're talking about. So I'll just leave you with this, that hope requires agency. And that could be from anger. Yes, anxiety and a bit of depression, as I mentioned earlier. But I do think anger is an energy that can be used in terms of righteous indignation and wanting to create a better world and holding those responsible on their feet to the fire. And as I particularly for the state, whose first job is to protect the people. And this issue is that we cannot have this done to us. We have to do it ourselves. And the issue about hope as well is this: to have genuine hope, and it's very close to religious notions of faith in some ways. Hope has to open the possibility that we're going to fail. Optimism is that it's a guarantee, but it's all going to work out fine. It'll be grand. Hope, you have to say, well, we may not make this, but that does not undermine the effort to actually try and make this possible. Every fraction of a degree, we keep global average warming below, whatever it's 2 degrees, 1.5, whatever it is. Each fraction is useful. It's worthwhile. It's worth engaging in this. It does require courage, because you're challenging, and some of the things I've even said there, challenging capitalism, growth, consumerism, and so on. Many of the things that some of you listening to me have just accepted as normal, natural, and we can't change them. But now is not the time to despair. Well, it's okay to temporarily maybe get lapse into that kind of depression and feeling overwhelmed. The issue is not to stay there. Come together, share, and then come together in terms of acting. And as I say here, hope, a bit like the sun, the solar radiation we get from the sun, is a renewable energy. So get angry, get hopeful, and get acting. Thanks very much.